Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining today's session. My name is Allison Sheldall with Current Powered by GE, and I will be facilitating today's webinar on the state of sustainability programs in manufacturing. I'd like to introduce our speakers, Mike Gualtieri, who is a VP and Principal Analyst at Forrester Research, and Garrett Miller, who is the Head of Commercial Industrial Software Solutions here at Current. Mike will be sharing with you the results from the research we commissioned with Forrester and what key insights we found for companies running sustainability programs in the manufacturing space. Then, Garrett will lead us through a discussion about how you can take your buildings beyond energy efficiency by enabling intelligent environments that will drive productivity outcomes for your business. And with that, I'll hand it over to Mike. Mike, please go ahead.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. My name is Mike Gualtieri, Principal Analyst on the team doing this research. And I'm going to talk to you about our research findings, some of our key findings, including the data on the state of sustainability programs in manufacturing. Next slide, please. The backdrop for this is just sustainability, and it's obviously an important and has become a hot topic in recent years. And basically, our perspective on this is that it's everyone's responsibility, not just as individuals, not just as governments and organizations, but also increasingly enterprises as well. Next slide, please. And next slide. Sorry, everyone, we're just one behind here. As a result of our research, we created a thought leadership paper that was commissioned by General Electric, and I believe that paper will be available to all of the attendees at the conclusion of this webinar. Next slide. So our research always starts with a research hypothesis, and our research hypothesis for this is that energy sustainability, so there's many forms of sustainability, but our focus on here was energy sustainability because it's particularly relevant to the audience that we were surveying, is that energy sustainability decision makers are challenged with building a strong business case for investment in energy sustainability projects due to a limited focus on specific energy sustainability technologies and opportunities. Now, what we do is we take this hypothesis and we craft a survey. Next slide, please. And we send the survey out, next slide, to respondents for our target audience. And you can see here some of the industries that we polled from our respondents. You can also see the size of the companies, the revenue of these companies, and what best describes the respondent's position. So with that in mind, we sent this survey out, compiled the results, and I'm going to present those results to you now. Next slide, please. And next slide. So as I said earlier, the social mandate to preserve and sustain our environment has never been greater, and organizations around the world pretty much all have some form of sustainability program. Next slide. And for manufacturers, the goal of efficiency, especially energy efficiency, aligns perfectly with sustainability because there's a direct correlation oftentimes between energy consumption and goals of sustainability. The other reason why we focused on energy efficiency, next slide, is because energy costs have become very unpredictable. The costs can go up, they can go down. Manufacturers might have peak periods. So there's a lot of inability to predict exactly where those energy costs are going. Next slide. One of the key questions we wanted to ask is, as companies implement energy sustainability solutions, what is the primary outcome that they hope to accomplish? So, thinking back to our hypothesis about energy, that is the number one and two. Lower the energy costs by generating power on site was one of the outcomes that was interesting. And also just to reduce overall energy consumption. So not really surprising. And if you think about the next couple, reducing operational costs, that can be directly correlated to that as well, and also reducing the carbon footprint, because ultimately that is an important sustainability goal. Next slide. So if we focus in on energy sustainability, next slide. We found that energy management is actually a key sustainability focus for manufacturers. Next slide. 91% of the sustainability and energy management decision makers, and that is the role that our survey, that's the role of our respondents. They said that energy management is very or extremely important to their overall organization. So this is clearly top of mind for manufacturers, and especially those in this role of sustainability as well. Next slide. And it may not be surprising as well that 86% of them, of these decision makers, say that energy management is extremely important to manufacturing operations. So energy is definitely a focal point when it comes to sustainability. It makes the most sense. There's certainly product design and development. That is a huge sustainability focus, but that's often focused in the design department. What manufacturers have control over is their processes and energy usage. Next slide. What we found, and this is probably not a surprise, is that LED lighting is the most commonly implemented solution. Next slide. If you think about it, LED lighting is sort of a no-brainer. You can immediately have a measurable reduction in energy efficiency through the conservation properties of LED lighting. So looking a little further at this, you can see at what stage is your company in terms of implementing the following. And 61% say LED lighting, already implemented. So, I mean, there's still a significant portion in there that haven't implemented that. And many have implemented LED lighting along with lighting controls, because it's not just about replacing the lighting, but it's about using the lighting in a manner that makes sense during manufacturing operations. And you can see some of the other processes here that are a little bit further down the list, like producing solar power on site, 27%. That's still a pretty significant number of companies looking into this, but it also portends some opportunity for manufacturers who aren't looking at some of these other aspects of sustainability. Next slide. And next slide. So there's a lot more sustainability opportunities than just lighting and lighting control. Certainly if you're not implementing that now, as the majority of these manufacturers say they are, certainly want to do that. Next slide. And those gains are significant. They can be easily measured through the consumption of energy, but we consider, and we have tested, you'll see on our data, these other energy sustainability initiatives. So certainly efficiency and conservation is about using less energy, and that's not necessarily about using a more efficient device, but it could also be the manufacturing process itself. On-site generation is an option for many, makes sense for many vendors, especially if they have peak periods, if they're in the right environment, and if costs are extraordinarily unpredictable. And there's also the point of sourcing. In some cases, you only have one energy choice or provider, but in other cases, there's many more sources. And along with generation and sourcing, many companies are turning to energy storage, storing energy for future use when they don't need it now, non-peak times to use at peak times. And less involved right now, but we think is going to be a lot more interesting to manufacturers, is using energy analytics and optimization. And this is more about using software and understanding energy usage in real time. We'll be discussing more of that when we discuss the intersection of IoT, Internet of Things, and energy management. Next slide. So I guess the good news, and it's not surprising, is that, look, sustainability and energy management is top of mind. And, it aligns completely with becoming a more efficient organization. But in looking at some of these other techniques, most energy programs lack some sort of long-term strategy. And you can see here that, many of these energy analytics, in particular, generation storage, very case-by-case, and in fewer cases, non-existent. Efficiency and conservation is probably the shortest path, and that's why you see that it's small scale, short term, and strategic comes out to the most. Next slide, please. So why? So we asked the question through our survey: why are companies not? Why don't they have a more comprehensive long-term energy sustainability strategy? Next slide. And what we found was that there's a disconnect between a local facility and the managers of a local facility and senior leadership. We know that it's important to both. We know that it's top of mind of senior leadership. We know that it's top of mind for local facility managers. Next slide. But there's a perception gap between those local managers and senior leadership. You can see here we asked them, rate your company's ability to measure the following potential outcomes. And you can see the senior leaders are much more bullish on their ability to do all of these categories here than the local managers. So there is a disconnect between how local facility managers view what's actually happening on the ground and the senior leadership. Next slide. And when you just ask them straight off, what stage is your company in implementing this, local managers perceive that there's a lower rate of adoption for energy sustainability compared to the corporate leaders. So, this is an interesting gap that we wanted to pursue more, and here's what we found of why that gap exists. Next slide. There's a lack of a holistic energy and sustainability plan. Many manufacturers, as you saw from the data, they go right to LED lighting and they go to the lighting opportunity. Again, I guess arguably that's the easiest to understand versus on-site energy generation and storage and some of those others. But there's also we also found a lack of central coordination and execution of sustainability plans. So oftentimes at the corporate level, there's a vision for this, there's a corporate vision for this, but it doesn't always execute across the board. It's often executed on a case-by-case basis. The other thing we found was that many local managers, and even at the corporate level, there's difficulty in building a business case or an ongoing investment for a more complicated energy management programs. So, the bottom line of that is that companies are missing opportunities when they don't think of their energy strategy in a holistic way. If they just think of it about one of these categories, for example, lighting, then they're missing out on the bigger picture. Next slide. Part of the reason of that complexity exists is because companies don't have the type of granular visibility into their energy usage that they need. And that's one of the exciting things about the Internet of Things. Next slide. We found that 82% of enterprises are interested in IoT, and IoT is connected devices, data from connected devices that can be used in various ways. We also see, next slide, is that the interest in IoT spans across all industries. So it might not be surprising that utilities and telecom are using it and planning to use it. So there's a wide interest in IoT for many things. Not just, we're not just talking about energy sustainability in these slides. This is just general IoT. But if you do think about it from a manufacturing standpoint, next slide. Manufacturing plants are littered with devices that consume energy. And the plants that contain these devices, they all have sensors, there's controllers, and increasingly these devices are connected. The problem with all of these connections and all of this data, it's often used for a very narrow purpose, for a very, to monitor the quality or effectiveness of the machine. It's not often used in the sustainability. We think that's changing. Next slide. So all of these IoT devices, it's great to think about, but they are not smart without a brain. And that's where software comes in to actually connect all of these devices, understand that energy usage, and once you can connect them and you have the appropriate software, you can understand your environment better. Next slide. So connected systems and connected lighting, connected devices can provide the intelligence required to take advantage of these other energy management use cases. Because then you'll understand the energy usage by device in real time. You'll be able to optimize that energy in real time, and it will provide input to energy planning and management to other strategies such as sourcing as well. Next slide. We also found that only 23% are taking actions based upon that data that comes from their connected systems. So there's not widespread use of IoT systems to actually collect data, analyze it, and then take actions based upon those data and insights. And when we think back to the gap between the corporate and the local plant, this is even a bigger gap because the decision to collect data, to have an IoT strategy for energy sustainability is often a corporate decision. So big opportunities in all areas of in those other non-LED lighting areas, but a prerequisite to it is really being able to connect a preponderance of your devices in lighting so that you can be smarter about how those are working. Next slide. So the conclusion of the report is really that, next slide, that there's lots of opportunities for manufacturers that they're not taking advantage of. A big reason for that is that there's a gap between how local managers are attacking the problem and a disconnect between what corporate leaders strategy, and the other big area is because of the connectivity. Next slide. So it's pretty straightforward. It's asking that question about how you can use energy more efficiently in sustainability, and then looking at those categories that we've laid out for sourcing, for analytics, for real-time usage, for energy optimization planning. And generally, that gap has to be filled, and that's the only way. Next slide, please. Plan strategically in implementing locally. So most corporate boards are setting out a sort of a vision for this, but those decisions are often made locally, but the budget holders are often at the corporate level. Next slide. So recommendations are to broaden your sustainability programs, create that strategic long-term sustainability plan for the entire corporation, but go down a level of detail, level of granularity to the plants. Centrally plan and implement those sustainability programs across all the facilities. So at the corporate level, it can't just be a vision to do this. It has to be a little more granular with concrete plans and technologies where you can leverage real-time energy usage. And to do that, a company needs to intersect their sustainability strategy with an IoT strategy. so that they have that analytics capabilities to build a business case for ongoing sustainability investments, number one, and number two, to actually provide that real-time optimization of energy usage. Next slide. Now, it's fairly complex when we think about IoT. This isn't something that a plant is going to hire a team to implement an IoT system. So you have to seek out partners that have pre-built energy management solutions to connected devices. So whenever you're thinking about lighting, that you might not think that's a strategic decision, but it should be, because with that connected lighting, with the energy analytics that it can provide, and with software that can also take energy usage information from other devices and make sense of it all in real time so you can optimize it. So seek out partners who can also add value by creating connected energy management solutions. So this isn't just about picking a more efficient device, but picking a device that works in an ecosystem of other devices in a connected architecture of energy management software. Next slide. So thank you. Those are our findings. Again, you can find a lot more detail in the thought leadership paper that GE will make available to you. And at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Garrett Miller. Garrett?
Super. Thanks, Mike. Great introduction and overview of the research findings there, and hopefully everybody else found those as compelling as we did on our side. So I'd like to pick up where Mike got us to so far, and really kind of take the IoT piece and talk about that in a little bit more, not a whole lot more detail, but at least give us all a framework to think about. What does IoT mean? How do we need to be thinking about that? Bring it back around to energy, and specifically and tactically, what are some of the things that can be done around lighting, around controls, and then what are some helpful strategies to look at expanding beyond that? And then one of the really interesting things, or at least we think it's very interesting, is to say, what can we do to look more broadly than just energy, both as it relates to sustainability, but also as it relates to efficiency and productivity more generally? And I think if we all, step back for a moment and think about sustainability, what does it mean? And we had some great examples from Mike earlier and some definitions. But if we think of one of the definitions that Mike put up there was to preserve and sustain the environment. And really, at the end of the day, that one of the best strategies to do that is efficiency in nearly everything that we do. And so we can talk about what some of those strategies are, and hopefully you'll find that to be interesting, and if all goes as planned, also helpful as you think about how to take things forward yourselves. So if we go to the next slide, what I want to do first is, kind of come back to this IoT concept. And for those of you who have been following the space and even just in popular media, we all know that there's a massive explosion of connected devices out there. And those connected devices can lead to really, really interesting things. I think that, as I step back and kind of survey the landscape, one of the most interesting findings I've had is that most people talk about IoT really in the context of the consumer space. And there's really an opportunity, and you saw some of the pictures and comments earlier from Mike in terms of plants and shop floors and warehouses and everything that's connected there. It's kind of funny, right? When we talk to manufacturers, they say, well, look, IoT, we've been doing that for decades. It's just kind of really been brought to the forefront from the whole consumer space. So regardless of whether or not your framework is one of a plant floor, or if it's one of thinking about the smartphone in your pocket or perhaps the smartwatch on your wrist, there is a proliferation of devices that's happening at an unprecedented speed. And so depending on which analyst firm or which big tech company you look to, somewhere around 50 billion devices are going to be connected to the internet by 2020. And I think the big question then becomes is, put the consumer side to the side for a moment, what does this really mean for your company and for you personally as you operate within that company? So if we go to the next slide, what we'll have here is what I think is a helpful framework to think about the Internet of Things. I think at a high level, everybody says, yes, it's something that's connected to the Internet. But if we take that to the next level and say, well, what does that really mean to be connected to the Internet? What we have done, or at least the way that we think about it on the GE side, is that there's really a four-tiered architecture for thinking about the Internet of Things. And if we kind of start at the bottom and build our way up, the first piece is really to think about the edge, right? And that is basically that's the thing and everything that surrounds that thing. And then how is it being connected? So there's a layer of connectivity as we kind of build up this architecture. And what's it connecting to? Ultimately, it's connecting to the cloud, the Internet. And then once you get into that cloud environment, there's a fourth layer in this simplified architecture of an IoT stack, which is the application layer. And this is really where you start to get additional intelligence. Certainly there's intelligence that lives at the edge, and there has to be edge compute to really get the benefits of a complete IoT deployment. But if you start to think at the application layer, really interesting things start to become available, particularly as we start thinking about how do we create some bridges between some of those either siloed data or potentially even looking at some of the bridges that need to be built between local plant managers and corporate leaders. As we saw, there's a significant disconnect there. And I think that's really where the cloud and the application layer can help bridge some of those gaps. So hopefully that's a helpful framework to think about IoT as we start to dig into things and talk about how can we leverage that as a tool to drive some of the strategies around a holistic energy management and sustainability management program. So if we go to the next slide. And, coming back to tangibly and tactically, and probably where many of you have started this energy journey, is around lighting. And lighting, many people probably don't immediately say, wow, well, that's an IoT play. But just to introduce Current for a moment, for those of you who haven't yet to meet us, we really are, as the slide says, born from the bulb, right? We're a 125-year-old lighting company that has reinvented itself for an IoT-enabled future. And what we're seeing happening is that the LED market is growing like gangbusters, and there will roughly be 95% penetration over the next less than 10 years. Now, the LED replacement cycle that's happening, there's a massive opportunity there for energy efficiency. And, kind of the quick math is you can cut your lighting costs by roughly half by swapping out your existing lighting infrastructure for LED-based lighting fixtures and bulbs. And so if you then say, well, let's hold on for a minute, and what is the real opportunity there? It's not just to decrease your lighting costs by 50%, but you can also deploy as part of that intelligent infrastructure. Now, that intelligent infrastructure really enables a tremendous amount of value beyond lighting itself. And so that infrastructure can be orchestrated and controlled to look more holistically across your entire landscape of what's being controlled, and ultimately what's being controlled is what's consuming energy. And so how do you best orchestrate that entire landscape is what I'd like to start talking about next. So if you go to the next slide, you'll see, and we just kind of build this whole thing out, I think get to the full picture here. What you'll see is, again, this idea with LED, it can really drive, having your energy costs. But it's more than just LED that we need to think about. Combining LED with sensors can get you to, if you're having it with LED, now if you add sensors in, you're really cutting your lighting energy costs by around 70%. Now, what that does, though, is allows you to put in place a digital infrastructure that can tap into the rest of your building subsystems and tap into the rest of your energy-consuming assets to get something that is really a real-time visibility, but also the ability to exercise controls to better manage those energy-consuming assets, and in some cases, energy-producing assets or energy-storing assets. And we believe, and what we've seen with our experience so far, is that there's an additional 10 to 20% of your overall energy consumption that can be taken out of your cost structure if you're looking at an energy management system more holistically. Now, what I was saying earlier is an opportunity to come back and revisit that and hit on that concept of saying, well, what about if we think beyond energy management systems? And if we look at leveraging that same infrastructure of sensors and controls to enable additional business outcomes and additional sustainability outcomes. And so we'll take a look at that as we start to get into the content a little bit more. So if we go to the next slide, and I think we can just do one more click and get the full picture here. So what you'll see is starting with controls. And if we come back to LEDs, the idea that, look, if we control those LEDs intelligently, we can drive additional cost savings. So you can see the conventional approach on the left-hand side of the image in front of you. They're not integrated. It's standalone control. Coming back to some of the things that Mike was hitting on, it's a siloed system that doesn't really allow you to expand and look at things holistically. So if you look towards the future and where lighting controls and really controls at large are going, is to be more of a wireless play, right? And if you think about, it's not just wireless lighting controls. That same wireless infrastructure that's put into place can really serve as the foundation for a wireless mesh network that's expandable into all sorts of different sensors and controls. So it's not just lighting, but it's also your HVAC systems. It can also be plug load. You can also expand it to look at metering your different production lines to understand how energy is being consumed across your entire footprint. So if you go to the next slide, what we have then said is, and where we have made investments on the GE side, is to say, let's think about things more holistically than just controls. Let's think about controls as a starting point, and what we like to say is it's the universal remote for your building. But it really goes beyond that. So if you have the controls infrastructure in place, you can also start to pull data out of those IoT-enabled systems, assets, sensors, controllers, whatever it might be, to really start to get that fleet-wide visibility. And I think that's something that's unique and really builds off of what Mike was sharing with us in terms of the Forrester findings, which is you need to be able to have that central company-wide program, but also the ability to have the insights across that program so you can start to make more intelligent decisions about how you want to act locally. And, as we saw earlier in the data, there is an extreme disconnect between the people who are looking and thinking about these things from a company strategic perspective and those that are picking up where they're leaving off, implementing those and also thinking strategically at the site level. How do you bridge that gap is something that we found extremely important and something that we've built into our overall offering, which you can see represented here in these different boxes. But providing that insight layer and the ability to tie those two together is really important, not just to bridge the gaps and make sure that people are on the same page, but also if you think about your energy management and in the context of your overall sustainability program, there's a limited set of funds that are out there, and we all need to be smart about how we're deploying those funds. So if you were to just simply take a single plant or a single site perspective, it would be hard to really best allocate corporate funds across that. Because you might say, look, if I'm looking at my individual site and I identify, let's say it's my HVAC units as the thing that's really the energy hog, and I'm going to allocate all of my costs against that. But let's say you put that in the broader context of the entire company. Now, all of a sudden, somebody who's got visibility across that complete portfolio can start to say, well, you know what, yes, Sue just came to me from the plant we were just talking about and says HVAC is a concern for her plant. But I can look at and stack rank and start to do some benchmarking across my portfolio and actually determine that, Sue's not doing so bad. I really need to divert more of my funding for energy conservation measures to a different site for perhaps a different problem. So having that visibility is really important. If you build off of insight and say, okay, well, great, I've got sort of first-line insight. I've got the ability to control the assets that are consuming that energy. What if I were to add in a layer of intelligence from a data science perspective? So we've made big investments in creating what we call the optimized layer, the optimized module that takes a lot of that machine learning capability that's out there to automate those optimization sequences. Now, a lot of people sometimes get concerned and they say, well, look, I don't want to automate anything. I'm not ready to turn things over to the algorithm just yet. And that's up to the customer to decide, right? There's the ability to either automate and completely turn it over to the automation side of things, or you can insert a person as part of that and give them the choice to say, yes, this is something that's interesting to me. This is a strategy I want to deploy, or not, or maybe it's a halfway measure. If you then look at the fourth layer that we've got here with Assure, this is really where the financial muscle of the portfolio gets flexed. So it's not just important to reduce overall energy consumption and the associated carbon emissions that go along with that. But it's also important to understand the cost that's associated there, because energy used in the morning versus energy used during the day versus energy used in the night, it doesn't cost the same, right? So we want to make sure that, yes, we're thinking about how do we drive down energy energy usage and carbon emissions holistically, but it's also important to add in that financial layer, again, coming back to where are you going to get your biggest bang for the buck to make sure that you're deploying cost-saving dollars in the right way and getting the biggest return to make sure that those are going the farthest. So for us at GE and within Current, we've built all of this on what is called Predix, and that's essentially the operating system for the Internet of Things, at least from the GE perspective. And GE Corporate has done a wonderful job of marketing Predix, and so many of you have likely heard of this. It's a great operating system. It's secure, it's scalable, it's intelligent. But as you look to potentially working with GE around energy management, you don't necessarily have to buy Predix. It's something that you're more than welcome to, but the applications that you would be consuming from us use that as part of it, and it's essentially comes as part of the application offering to our customers. So that's the stack that we've got as it relates to energy management. And if you go to the next slide, please. I want to come back and talk about this idea of energy management and really that getting into the efficiency side of the equation, being able to drive and fund additional business outcomes, be they sustainability or be they purely a productivity perspective. But again, coming back to this idea of productivity and efficiency really being the underpinnings of a sustainability program at large. If you start with efficiency, really thinking about you have a set cost structure today. The energy management solution that at a very high level that we just walked through can really drive down the energy cost side of things. But there's also a maintenance component to it. So if you think about those assets that are ultimately responsible for your energy costs, those have their own costs associated with it, right? So we talked about, this idea of asset replacement and wanting to be able to look across your whole portfolio. There's also not just looking at it purely from an energy consuming perspective, there's also the cost that's associated with maintaining those assets. So perhaps you have an asset that is actually pretty energy efficient, but it just takes a tremendous amount of effort to keep it up and running. Well, that also might be something that you want to look at replacing. Again, how are you going to free up these dollars to go and do the things where they could be better spent? And so if you look at what can be achieved from the energy management portfolio, both in terms of better maintenance and asset trade-off decisions as it relates to CapEx and OpEx optimization, as well as the overall energy cost structure and energy usage structure, and ergo your carbon footprint, that frees up a certain amount of savings. Now, the other thing that's really nice with this is that it also, if you go down the energy management pathway, at least in the way that we've been talking about it, and put in place this Internet of Things enabled solution, it puts in place that digital infrastructure that can be leveraged to go do a whole host of things that we'll start to transition the conversation to talk about. So those savings and that infrastructure translate into productivity opportunities as well as additional efficiency opportunities to say, how are you actually going to increase your overall performance that drives that productivity profile? So on the one hand, using digital and Internet of Things enabled tools to drive down a structure as it relates to cost, but also to increase that structure as it relates to productivity and overall business outcomes. So that's the framework, how the funding all fits together, or at least how it all can fit together. One of the unique things that GE can offer with this is the ability to finance all of this. And so what's nice about that is that, particularly if you start and look at it from the efficiency side of things, you can actually go and implement an energy management system that in its first full month of productive usage can return cash flow positive type situations where that cash flow can then be diverted to make investments, again, whether that's in additional efficiency programs, additional sustainability programs, or productivity programs. It really creates a nice bit of of optionality to go do additional things. So if you go to the next slide, we'll start to get into what are some of those additional things. So let's take it and kind of start to, make it a little bit more, hopefully, tangible for all of you, and come into the warehouse space. So I think if we're all, talking about paint manufacturers here, and certainly GE is one of them, and we take one slice of that part of the business and we look at the warehouse, there is a digital warehouse of the future that is out there. And for us, as we look at our own business and talk to our customers, really the desire and drive is to get to a situation where we've seamlessly integrated the automation, augmentation, and autonomy of functions that are happening within those warehouses and ultimately within those manufacturing plants. So the first piece that we see of where we're trying to get to, and perhaps you can see yourselves in this as well, is context-aware assets. Now, this really starts to relate to what is the job to be done, and how can assets understand and start to organize and execute themselves, obviously humans needing to be part of that, but how are we best executing that job to be done? I think the second one that we see out there is collaborative robots. And the idea here is that it's really about accelerating and amplifying the human that is part of that equation, not necessarily replacing it. Certainly today and for the foreseeable future, the human can't be replaced. That intelligence, that cognition, and that context of the human is something that's going to be there for quite a while. But there's obviously opportunity to enhance that. And I think if we continue down that enhancing pathway and look at bionic enhancement, whether that's thinking about augmented reality, and I think there's some really interesting things that can be done, particularly if we start talking about a warehouse and pick and pack, and how are we augmenting, the field of view for those employees, or whether they're on a production line. But there's also the spatial safety side of things. So if we can help humans be safer by automating and leveraging IoT-enabled type solutions to be safer, I think keeping humans safe is part of the overall sustainability goals here is a really important one. That as we start to look at the future of a warehouse and ultimately the future of a manufacturing environment, how do we best do that? I think there's some really cool opportunities that we're working on ourselves. And we're excited to share those with folks such as yourselves and our customers. The last one, then, as we start to look at what does that future look like, is the self-learning system. And I think that relates to, really all three of them. But how are you really marching down that path of continuous improvement, continuous efficiency, whether that's efficiency as it relates to safety, or whether it relates to energy, whether it relates to regulatory controls, is really important. So if you go to the next slide, and we say, look, if that's great, that's really kind of where we all want to get to. At the same time, we know that we can't all just make the jump and be there now. That future is going to continue to morph and change and grow and become even brighter. But we also know that there are challenges and trends out there that we're all facing today. So whether that's thinking about SKU count proliferation, and you could talk about that from an engineering and design to manufacturing, or simply just from, how are you managing all of these things in a warehouse, there are a lot more products that are coming out there. And in fact, there's really just more of everything. And how does all of that get orchestrated and managed? You saw some of the statistics that Mike was sharing with us earlier in terms of, yes, there are IoT-enabled assets that are out there, but most of them are just sitting there generating data. So whether it is a data silo issue, it's a lack of connectivity, which Mike also hit on being a really core component of how are we going to best take advantage of IoT. how are you best taking advantage of those assets? How are you connecting them? How are you not only connecting them to the internet and making sure that you're executing against the promise of that individual asset, but also orchestrating those assets is a really incredibly challenging and important part of actually coming into the promise of what IoT can provide. And then finally, product protocols. And this actually, I think, really starts to relate back into the sustainability side of things. As we start to see, chain of custody requirements, whether that's talking about, if you're manufacturing food goods, or if you're thinking about sustainability protocols from other types of programs, whether it's FSC would be an interesting one if you're in the timber industry, and really beyond. How are we best managing those product sustainability issues as they relate to products that come through our environment, whether we're manufacturing them, simply storing them, and packing them, and sending them out? So if you go to the next slide, any challenge that doesn't also get turned into an opportunity is a challenge wasted. And so what we have done is to try to think through what are those challenges that we ourselves are experiencing, and also what are the challenges that our customers are facing, and how can we really turn those into opportunities? So driving better inventory management with a digital and IoT-enabled environment really drives a big piece of what we're looking at in our own operations. Understanding and better utilizing that space is another big opportunity, both just for overall efficiency of business operation, but also as we start to think about the sustainability impact of our overall operations. If we can do more with less, then that's a win for not only the bottom line, but also the sustainability line. Optimization, we've talked about a bit, and there's certainly ways to do intelligent automation with the sensors and data collection technologies that are out there, and I think we've touched on that a bit. Finally, then, how do you leverage those existing environmental conditioning systems to deliver the data that's necessary for some of those product protocols that we talked about, right? So whether that's cold storage, whatever it might be, those environmental conditioning systems, specifically thinking about HVAC units, and the controls and sensors that surround those as they relate to temperature, humidity, and so forth, that same data can be applied to ensure regulatory compliance as we start to go through what are the different demands that are being placed on us as companies in those warehouse and in those manufacturing environments. So if you go to the next slide, please. What we have done in our strategy within Current is to say, look, if we're going out there and where we can really help our customers is to put in place energy management systems. We have a rich heritage in energy, really from all aspects of that value chain. And we do a pretty good job in understanding that and building tools to really manage it. And as we said, that digital infrastructure can really be leveraged to do lots of other interesting things. From having that wireless mesh network to having that IoT network that sits at your site, the ability to expand it with additional sensor and control capabilities, or whether to look at leveraging the things that you're going to be putting in for energy management anyway. And then we talked about some of the environmental sensors and how those can be used for product protocols. So we realize there's a lot of value there. We also realize that we as GE are not necessarily going to be the expert for every single one of those opportunities that sit out there. And so instead of us trying to go and say, great, that platform, that infrastructure, we're going to go and build an application to help our customers and help ourselves do each one of these things. Instead of doing that, what we have done is to go out and source a pretty significant ecosystem. And we've got hundreds of different partner applications within this ecosystem that are targeted to use cases that all of us address and find every day. And so within those hundreds of applications, the benefit to that is that you have subject matter experts, people who are building their businesses around solving different pieces of our business problems, of your business problems, and that's what their dedication is towards, right? So our dedication is around how do we best deliver a world-class energy management solution, and our partners are really focused on different other parts of business operations that can leverage that same infrastructure to make their applications more intelligent, more valuable for you and for us. So what we have done is to say, look, we recognize that there's a tremendous amount of value there. We recognize also that there are a tremendous number of applications. And so what we've tried to do is to really boil that down into an easy starter pack of where to get started with saying, look, okay, I get the energy management side of things, but I really want to start going down the path and marching towards that digital warehouse, that digital plant of the future. What can we do to get started? And you know, it's really interesting talking to this audience here because we as GE struggle with the very similar questions and the same questions that you all do. You know, we've got lots of warehouses. We've got lots of manufacturing environments. We want to make those more intelligent, and we need to have somewhere to get started. And so, you know, this is not only something that, you know, we'd like to have you take into consideration, it's also something that we're taking into our own business. And so what we have done is said, look, where can we best start? I think we talked about space utilization. That's a big one for us. I think a big one for the industry overall is how are we getting the most out of the existing building footprints that we have today? How are we doing asset tracking? You know, how many times have people tried to figure out where did that forklift get parked? The ability to do that asset tracking, the ability to do inventory management, and ultimately environmental monitoring like we've talked about. So we put together what we think is a pretty compelling place to start with some of our key partners that we are also going down that path ourselves, so Keon, Fairview, and Aisle 411, to say, if you buy into the energy management side of things and you see that network being put in place, you know, here's a nice way to get started on that path towards, you know, the digital future. So if you go to the next slide, what you'll see here is a pictorial representation of what that really looks like. So, you know, using, again, coming back to, well, how does all of this happen? If you're going in and doing an LED project, you're probably going to be doing a controls project, and I would really encourage you to think about how can you use that effort, those people up on ladders or on cherry pickers, doing the work at the same time of putting in place that digital infrastructure. You know, if that's already been done, and you're still saying, you know, you recognize the need to do energy management, you like the idea of putting in place that infrastructure, can certainly be done. Just some cost savings and you know, always looking for efficiencies if you do that at the same time as a lighting replacement to LED. So a couple of things to highlight on the platform that goes in place here. One of the mantras you'll hear from us quite frequently is this idea of being open on the top and open on the bottom. Open on the bottom really meaning that we're going to go out there and tap into whatever type of infrastructure you have in place today. So whether that's, you know, an existing energy management system, whether those are production lines that need to be metered and understood how energy is flowing through those, we're going to work with whatever kind of infrastructure you have in place today. And be agnostic about it. So that's the bottom. That's the open on the bottom. Open on the top then really starts to get into whose data is it? And the short answer is, and then even the long answer, the only answer is it's your data. And you have the right to do with that data what you so choose, whether that's just take it and crunch the numbers yourselves. Hopefully you see the value in having that data be consumed by the energy management solutions that Current has to offer. But it's also about who do you want to have access to that data? Do you want to have potentially, and we'd hope not, but it's your data and yours to do with what you choose, have that be surfaced up and fed out through our APIs to a different energy management provider, you know, and just use GE Current as your IoT edge and cloud infrastructure, but the application layer for energy management. Maybe you decide you've got something that works and you want to stay with that, but you know that you need to get into that real-time data and that orchestration, that de-siloing of different systems that are out there. We can do that. We'd love to also help you on the energy side, but ultimately it's your choice. And then also leveraging those same APIs, that same infrastructure, that same data to pump out into the additional productivity or efficiency applications that are out there that sit within our partner ecosystem. Your data, your choice. So if you go to the next slide, I think we've probably talked about this one of how are we building that, you know, using LED or solar projects really. as a reason to be putting in this intelligent infrastructure that then gets surfaced up either to our energy management systems or it is an open platform to the other applications we've talked about. So if you go to the next slide. This just comes back to really what we've been talking about in terms of going from the edge to the cloud where we do the sense making and the applications that leverage that infrastructure and that architecture. This also ties back to that kind of four-tiered architecture we talked about with connectivity really being represented by that blue arrow. If you go to the next slide, I think we're going to start running out of time. I did want to make sure that we left room for questions. So I think everybody's going to get these slides. This is a great example of one of our bundle partners and the benefits that they've been able to deliver using an IoT environment to start delivering inventory accuracy of close to 100%. You can see, I think the picture we should all pay attention to is the one that's in the challenge. That's probably much more relevant to all of us on the phone here, but let you all go through that. So I do want to make sure we get some interaction here. So next slide, please. And just wrap up here on why GE. We've got a pretty good legacy of innovation, really, that goes beyond the product itself to include the data. GE, as many of you have probably heard, has made a big investment into the digital future. We have our own practice internally as well as externally called GE Digital. And, if you've listened to or perhaps read some quotes from our chairman, Jeff Immelt, we are a digital industrial company. And we believe, and we see this happening, that most industrial companies and probably all industrial companies are going to need to become digital industrial companies. And we're here to share our experience, to partner with all of you to help you on that journey. And we look forward to that. So some of the benefits: scalable, secure, smart, right? We're doing it ourselves. We have a platform that we leverage in Predix that's a good place to start. Open on the top and open on the bottom, we talked about, so I won't belabor that. Really the idea here is that we are creating a digital engine that's going to power all of your intelligent environment needs. And that's really what our goal is here. And we talked about some of the energy efficiency savings, being able to subsidize what other outcomes you may want to drive towards, whether they're sustainability as they relate to product safety and stewardship, whether it's people safety, or whether it's just looking at overall business productivity and efficiency. I think we've got a rich ecosystem as well as solutions ourselves to help you down that journey. So with that, I will pause and turn it back to the moderator and see if we've got any questions for a handful of minutes here.
Great. Thanks, Mike. Thanks, Garrett. To the first question here, this one's for Garrett. Certainly when you talk about data and intelligent environments, the question always comes up around security. How does your system address data security?
Yeah, that's definitely a common question we get. And really, if you think back to that slide that we went through with kind of the four-tiered architecture of an IoT stack, there's security that needs to be embedded at every single component of that. So for us, and I'll just maybe give an example or two along each step of the way. If you start at the edge and think about the connectivity that has to happen between whatever you're using as a gateway to connect and communicate with those IoT-enabled assets, that communication, for us, the way that we approach it, that communication between your gateway and between your asset is encrypted. And so we use AES 128, that's NSA approved, that's good for secrets. We use that same industry standard to encrypt and secure the communication that's happening at the edge itself. And then if you look at going from the edge to the cloud and that connectivity layer, there's also a level of encryption that happens as well as two-way authentication. So that's kind of the second piece. The third piece then is really looking at the cloud itself and how is that being secured. And there's really kind of two layers to that. One is, what is your digital security strategy that surrounds it, which is multi-layered. But then there's also actually a physical layer of security around how are your cloud servers and your data centers That's for us and for our hosting partners to worry about how are those being secured. And then ultimately on the application layer, there's another layer of security as it relates to user authentication and who's actually getting access to the application layer. So security is top of mind for all of us as we're moving into the digital world. And as you think about that IoT infrastructure, it's really important to be looking at how is each of that, regardless of who you're partnering with, right? We would love to partner with all of you, but we realize that we're not the only partner you're going to have out there. And you've really got to look at the security components as it relates to each piece of that stack.
Thanks for that, Garrett. And I want to be respectful of everyone's time. We are coming up on the hour here. So if we did not get to your question, we will follow up with you via email. And I just also wanted to mention that we will share these slides with you as well as the full thought leadership paper that has more details on the research. And thank you, everyone, for joining. Have a great day.